Hey folks, and welcome to another video from aplaintruth.info and questioning to everything find truth. This is from a book from Billy Shears, The Memoirs of Billy Shears by Thomas Hugh Harriot. It's 666 pages and cost $33.33. It's from Amazon. The Memoirs of Billy Shears reveal infallible proof and other overwhelming evidence to finally prove all these decades later that Paul McCartney really died in 1966. Paul was replaced by William Shepard Billy Shears and has been playing the part of Paul, recording and performing ever since he blew his mind out in a car when he didn't notice the lights had changed. Just as the Beatles album contained hundreds of clues about Paul's death, other friends and the bands also made Paul as dead songs, including the Rolling Stones, the Bonzo Doodah Band, the Bonzos, The Who, Donovan, and Elton John. This book discusses some of their songs, as well as some by Paul, George, and Ringo that went beyond the Beatles' years. Uses over 200 songs to explain that Paul's switch to establish historical context and to add support, richness, and texture to the book's concepts. The Memoirs of Billy Shears is fully encoded, providing a new reading experience. Readers will not only be able to decode Paul's songs, but also can break the acrostical code with this book. And again, words have many different meanings and have been changed over time. Apocalypse used to mean lifting the veil of untruths and lies, and now apocalypse means a very bad ending to things. Conspiracy used to be agreement, union, unanimity. And now conspiracy is a conspiracy set about after the Kennedy assassination to confuse and conflate. And then there's also confuse, which literally means to render elements indistinguishable indeed. So there are many anomalies with Paul McCartney, or the faux Paul McCartney, but one is he's a Sir Paul McCartney, also was decorated by the French government as well for his service. His service to whom? His service to the dark side. Here we see two completely different pictures of William Shears Campbell and Paul McCartney. Mr. Campbell had to use a pseudonym author to write the book before his contract wouldn't be null and void about him assuming Paul McCartney after Paul McCartney was died when he had his mind blew out in a car. He hadn't noticed the lights had changed. Here the earlobes are different, and there's much forensic evidence, including voice prints that clearly show that the Paul McCartney today, who is right-handed, had to learn to play left-handed, is not the Paul McCartney of yesteryear. And another convincing is the new Paul McCartney is 3 to 4 inches taller, is why they never toured again. So did Paul McCartney really die? Did he really just blow his mind out in a car? Well, they celebrated it with the Beatles album, the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. They never toured again after 1966 because it would become too obvious. He was clearly taller and hadn't learned the bass guitar to play left-handed, so they could never go on tour. That, and according to in the book here, that he had many plastic surgeries so that Mr. Wallace Billy Shears would look more like Paul McCartney and could pull it off. But look at the Beatles album, folks. It's a funeral procession. It's all about having a funeral for the Beatles, okay? And there's so many things in here that are so obvious to see, including one Aleister Crowley, who is in the photo as well. Now, what is Mr. Reversal, who does everything in the mirror and by reverse as part of the satanic principle? What is he doing in the Beatles album? Well, they're telling you everything's in reverse. Now, what do these lyrics say? Partly as the last song in the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared. They'd seen his face before, but nobody was sure if he was from the House of Lords. All right, so they're telling you that he went across an intersection, he picked up a gal after being in a studio, went through an intersection, ran a red light, and was killed. And then here we clearly see in the Beatles album as well that they have Paul's guitar left-handed in there. You can see, and it says Paul D in the Beatles symbology. And also on the drum, if you set up a mirror on the drum, everything is reversal. Aleister Crowley, Die the 11th one, Paul McCartney, Die. And then we get into the Abbey Roads album as well. And there we have some very interesting things telling us behind the scenes, hidden in plain sight, about the Abbey Roads, the Gravedigger, Paul McCartney having a cigarette in his right hand when he's left-handed. He's barefoot, meaning, and then you have the Gravedigger in front. So again, here you can clearly see it's black and white on the floor, on the ground, and it's clearly a funeral procession. John Lennon's white suit symbolizes the color of mourning in Eastern religions. Ringo Starr, the more traditional black. George Harrison wearing denim, the color of mourning in Canada. I don't know if that's true or not. It's a reminder, they said, that in some cultures the dead are buried without their shoes, is why Paul is barefoot. In the background, you see a Volkswagen Beetle with a license plate LMW28 if, meaning Paul would be 28 if he were alive. And then in a police van in the background, parked on the side of the road, is a black police van, which is said to symbolize authorities who kept silent about Paul's fatal fender bender. All right, so moving on, this was sent to me by Vlad Jones. George Martin, the Beatles producer, came out of British Naval Intel and took a music course at Royal Academy in London, where he was taught by his mother of Jane Asher, Paul McCartney's girlfriend, from 65 to 67. Richard Asher, Jane's father, Richard, was an MK Ultra doctor dabbing in hypnotism. McCartney lived in Asher House in that period. Strange for the world's biggest rock star to live with a girlfriend's parents at the height of Beatlemania. Richard Asher killed himself in 1969 and lay undiscovered in the basement where Paul allegedly wrote many Beatles hits. All right, and just a few more notes about Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band cover, which is a funeral. In front is a yellow floral display. When looked at carefully, can be read as Paul or simply P for Paul. Note that younger Ringo is sad as if he'd lost a friend. To the right of the stone is a statue of a girl looking down to the right at a flaming car. This is lovely Rita, the meter maid, who saw Paul's accident and the flaming car. The reason Paul was in an accident was because he was looking at lovely Rita. Paul himself is seen with his hand over his head, which is an Eastern blessing for the deceased. Paul holds a cor anglais, at the end of which is a small hook representing the reaper's scythe. The four-armed doll at the bottom of the cover points with one arm to Paul and is holding some sort of floral bouquet. On the record version, the inside photo of the band shows Paul with a patch on his left arm, which reads OP Dead for, quote, officially pronounced dead. Other sources say it stands for Ontario Provincial Police, where William Campbell was an officer when he won the infamous look-alike contest. On the back cover of the record version, Paul is facing backwards, symbolizing his nonconformance with the living. On the back cover of the record version, George points to the line, quote, Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock, the day, the time of the accident. And then we already went through Abbey Roads, but on the Yellow Submarine album, on the front cover, Paul has his hand above his head, again the Eastern blessing for dead, and the Yellow Submarine on the cover is underground beneath the remaining Beatles. This is Paul's coffin. All right, wrapping up the Sgt. Pepper's theme. This is from BillyShears.com website. Frequently asked questions. When did Paul McCartney really die? Yes, he's dead. Proof is in the book. When did Paul McCartney die? September 11th, 1966. Can't make this up. What was the first song William Shepard, the man who replaced Paul, took part in recording? It was Strawberry Fields Forever. What was the first Beatles album showing William on the cover? It was a collection of Beatles oldies released 3 months after Paul died, depicted William on the cover without any attempt whatsoever to make him look like Paul. 5. What was the Beatles album that William took part in recording? Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. 6. How, when, and where did John Lennon first meet William Shepard? Well, Brian Epstein introduced William to John on 16 December 1966, 5 days after Paul died in Paris. 7. Did Paul McCartney write or dictate this book? No, Paul died decades before the book was begun. Did William Shepard write this book? No, this book was written by encoder Thomas E. Urhariet. Where did Urhariet get the material? It was based on the work by William Shepard, currently now Paul McCartney. Quotations were modified and whatnot. Which part of the book is nonfiction? Everything proving that Paul died and was replaced is correct and historical. Did Urhariet really plan this book with Paul McCartney when they met at a beach in Southern California? No, Urhariet, who was only 7 years old when Paul died, never met Paul. The story about Urhariet meeting William on the Southern California beach one hot day after Paul left a recording studio in Los Angeles is merely a legend that was invented. To what extent was William, who replaced Paul, involved in writing or encoding the memoirs of Billy Shears? The encoding was done entirely by Thomas Uriot, even though the reader realized much of the material could have been known only by William, the new Paul, or by his closest confidants, and even though William is the primary source, we maintain the position that William Paul had nothing to do with it. This is because of legal claims. All right, so let's move on. But the book of Billy Shears was written as a pseudonym, so Mr. Wallace would not violate his contract that they had to remain silent about taking over for Paul McCartney. All right, moving forward, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, Shaping the Moral, Spiritual, Cultural, Political, and Economic Decline of the United States of America, a must-read book by Mr. John Coleman, highly respected man. All right, so the fact that the Beatles had their music and lyrics written for them by Theo Adorno was concealed from public view. John Coleman, former MI6 agent. Here you see the Beatles using their symbology. And then the logos was the counter trend as the bad guy, sympathy for the devil. You get how this all works? Rolling Stones were mastered by the Orders of Malta by a member of Prince Rupert Lowenstein, who sponsored Sympathy for the Devil in '68. The prince was also a member of the very powerful Sacred Military Constantine Order of St. George, which is in close power to the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. So then they had the 60s British invasion. Why is the U.S. flag the same colors as the British flag, folks? Red, white, and blue, if we supposedly fought them to death. All right, so the British invasion began on the question authority, grow your hair long, hippies and flower power, and morphed into the anti-war gang of hell no, we won't go. It's interesting to note that the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, as well as its child organization, the Stanford Research Institute, developed the Grateful Dead, among other things. You see that Alan Trist, a social engineer for Tavistock Institute, became the shadow manager of the Dead. Trist was one of the principal founding members of the Tavistock that we covered yesterday. Now, who is this Theodore Adorno? He worked at the Tavistock Institute and was the brains behind the Beatles, as he held the rights to the music, and eventually his estate sold those rights to Michael Jackson. Adorno, a classical musician, wrote their music, and it was filtered down through Paul, who could not read a note of music. In fact, the only halfway real musician in the band was George Harrison. John was a poet who could strum a few chords, and Ringo a hack drummer at best. George often wondered why they never wanted to use his songs. Paul ended up being knighted, and you don't get knighted unless you have done you were told and made your masters proud. The Beatles were introduced to the public as a means to spread the youth culture, which led to spreading of the New Age culture, and this was all geared up, setting up a nihilistic culture that is all present today. It's called divide and conquer, but this gets into a whole different Pandora's box. Things are not what they seem. Theodore Adorno left Germany in the spring of 1934. During the Nazis' era, he resided in Oxford, New York, and Southern California. He wrote several books that became famous, including The Dialectic of Enlightenment, Philosophy of New Music, The Authoritarian Personality, Minimia Moralia. From those years come his provocative critiques of mass culture and cultural industry. Returning to Frankfurt, he took up the position in the philosophy department. Adorno quickly established himself as a leading German intellectual and a central figure in the Institute of Social Research. Founded as a freestanding center for Marxist scholarship in 1923, the institute had been led by Max Horkheimer since 1930. It provided the hub for what was to become the Frankfurt School. Adorno became the institute's director in 1958. Stanford.edu, you can look this up. The phenomenon of the Beatles was not a spontaneous rebellion by the youth against the old social system. Instead, it was carefully plotted to introduce a conspiratorial body which could not be identified, a highly destructive and divisive element into a large population group targeted for change against its will. New words and phrases were prepared by Tavistock, introduced to America along with the Beatles, such as rock in relation to music sounds, teenager, cool, discovered, and pop music were a lexicon of disguised words signifying the acceptance of drugs, and arrived with accompany the Beatles wherever they went to be discovered by teenagers. Incidentally, the word teenagers was never used until just before the Beatles arrived on the scene, courtesy of the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. Tavistock and its Stanford Research Center created trigger words, which then became into general usage around rock music and its fans. Trigger words created a distinct new breakaway from largely young population group, which was persuaded by social engineering and conditioning to believe the Beatles really were their favorite group. All trigger words devised in this context of rock music were designed for mass control of the new targeted group, the youth of America. The Beatles did a perfect job. Perhaps more correct, the Tavistock and Stanford did a perfect job. The Beatles merely reacting like trained robots, quote, with a little help from my friends. Code words were used in making it cool. The Beatles became a new visible type, more Tavistock jargon, and as such, it was not long before the group made new styles, fads in clothing, hairstyles, and language usage, which upset the older generation as was intended. Question authority. This was part of the fragmentation maladaptation process worked out by Willis Harman and his team of social scientists and genetic engineering tinkers and put into action. Following the Beatles, who incidentally were put together by the Tavistock Institute, came other made-in-England groups. I mean, do you think these Beatles really came from Liverpool altogether and made it on their own? Four guys just from the same area? Give me a break. Theodore Adorno wrote their cult lyrics and composed all their music. Another interesting thing is the Beatles were knighted by Queen Elizabeth in the 60s for their good work. Ringo told the press he'd been so nervous that he had to smoke pot in the bathroom before he met the Queen. And then Paul was knighted again. Little info on the Frankfurt School is a Marxist-affiliated school of social theory and philosophy. The first generation of the Frankfurt School were all Jews, and the Institute of Social Research itself funded by Jewish millionaire Felix Weil. It was created during the Weimar Republic and soon became very influential. The Tavistock Institute was founded in London in 1946 with the aid of the grant from, drumroll please, the Rockefeller Corporation. It is not for-profit think tank policy and consulting organization, and it publishes human relations and host evaluations. Three elements combine to make the Institute unusual, if not unique. Its independence of being entirely self-financing with no subsidies from the government or other sources. The action research orientation places it between, but not in, the worlds of academia and consultancy, and its range of disciplines include anthropology, economics, organizational behavior, political science, psychoanalysis, psychology, and sociology. Tavistock is headquartered in London. Its prophet was Sigmund Freud. He was given a mansion by Princess Bonaparte. Tavistock's pioneering work in behavioral science, along with Freudian lines of controlling humans, established it as a world essential of foundation ideology. Today it operates a $6 billion a year network of foundations in the U.S., all funded by U.S. taxpayer dollars. So here's the Committee of 300, which Bill Gates is a member of, and all the breakdowns of here. And people, all of this is all around a connection to the Jesuits who run all the Freemasons and all of these groups see here. But you can see how the Tavistock dominates the military, industrial, the RAND think tank, the CIA, the NGOs, the media, and the Bilderberg Group. All right, moving on, without going into technicalities of the Club of Rome, its purpose was to act as a counterweight against post-industrial agriculture and military expansion, called the Post-Industrial Agricultural Zero-Growth Society. Here we have the Stanford Research, the Tavistock Institute, and other centers applied social psychiatry joined in. In 1994, Tavistock signed a major contract with not a space agency to evaluate the effects of its non-space program. The club itself was founded in 1968 as part of the call for the New World Order inside a one world government. When the club became was an instrument to enforce limits of growth on industrial nations, and the United States was to be its first target. The introduction of the four, quote, mop-top dudes with incredible talent from a town in Liverpool, England, to continue to influence generations even today, was scientifically planned, well-executed agenda to steer the youth of the 70s to counterculture they could identify with, giving teenagers the false choice and influence their culture of their music. Remember, they spend billions and billions of years even today, on brain mapping, folks. What are they studying? Between our ears, behind our eyes. Billions of dollars. In 1937, the Rockefeller Foundation, started funding research to find the effects of new forms of mass media, especially radio. Several universities joined up. It was formed at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, where Faux Einstein was a professor originally. Paul Lassifer, director of public radio. Theodore Adorno, chief of music division. Frank Stanton, research from CBS sent to help the project, went on to become president of Columbia Broadcast Systems. First project was to study soap operas known as radio dramas at the time. Project researched the 1938 Halloween broadcast, The War of the Worlds. They found that an estimated 6 million people heard the broadcast, and a quarter of them thought it was real. Most of the people who panicked did not think it was an invasion from Mars that was occurring, but rather an invasion by the Germans. It was determined that because of the radio broadcast from Munich crisis earlier in the year. The masses were prone to this. A third research project was that of listening habits. Because of this, a new method was developed to survey an audience. This was dubbed the Little Annie Project. The official name was the Stanton-Lasserfeld Program Analyzer. Dr. John Coleman mentioned in the past that the black nobility, that's the Jesuits, favored the Rolling Stones pop culture band. What he did not tell you was exactly who was it that they were controlling the band at a very top, higher than the Tavistock Institute. Well, as usual, I'm here to help fill in the dots. To introduce new cults and continue to boost their already functioning, while include rock music gangsters such as the Rolling Stones, a gangster group much favored by the European black nobility, and all of the Tavistock rock groups, which began with the Beatles. It's not mentioned here, but the Rolling Stones were created from the same source and with the same purpose. Beatles were supposed to be the good guys, while the Rolling Stones were the bad guys. Also, the Stones were experts in creating repeating riffs, meaning a musical phrase that's looping over and over again. Woo, 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 satisfaction and jumping jack flash. These repeating riffs trigger the mind and make one receptive to whatever sub-messages you want to transfer into the minds of the listener. Very sophisticated. In the case of the Rolling Stones, we have satanic messages in their lyrics and have repeated that over and over through the years. A more recent example is Bridge to Babylon. Remember, they had Baphomet on the cover on Goat's Head Soup, the devil. The Rolling Stones were mastered by the Order of Malta, a member by the name of Prince Rupert Lowenstein, who sponsored Sympathy for the Devil. The prince was also a member of the powerful Sacred Military Constantine Order of St. George, who we mentioned earlier, in the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. Both Order of Malta, and here we see with the dead pervert, pedophile, terrible person, buddy with Prince William, Prince Charles, Jimmy Savile here with the Beatles. This guy is just disgusting. I can't even look at him. All right, moving on. Tavistock and Stanford research then embark on a second phase of the work commissioned by the Committee of 300. This new phase turned up the heat for the social change in America. As quickly as the Beatles had appeared on American seed, so did the Beat Generation trigger words designed to separate and fragment society. The media now focused its attention on Beat Generation, Allen Ginsberg. Other Tavistock coined words seemingly out of nowhere. Beatniks, hippies, flower children, flower power became a part of the vocabulary. Tune in, drop out, we covered before. Dirty jeans, let your hair go long unwashed, all of that. The newly group created its lifestyle, swept millions among Americans into the cult. A radical revolution occurred while the older generation stood by helplessly, unable to identify the source of the crisis and thus reacting in a maladaptive manner against its manifestation, where all drugs of all types, marijuana and later LSD, so conveniently provided them by the Swiss pharmaceutical Sandoz following the discovery of its chemist Albert Hofmann, who provided the CIA, who made all the LSD for everyone. And the Grateful Dead, as I chronicled before, distributed it in their concerts. The Committee of 300 financed the project through the bank's S.C. Borberg and was carried out to America by philosopher Aldous Huxley. The new wonder drug was distributed in sample-sized packages, handed out free of charge on college campuses. Why are vaccines free, folks? Across the United States and at Rock's concerts, which became a leading vehicle for proliferating the use of drugs. The question cries out, where was the DEA at the time? In much the same way as the Committee of 300, the Beatles, who was overseer of the Tavistock and coordinated with the Jesuits, the Beatles to popularize social drugs with the youth of American Hollywood in crowd. Ed Sullivan was sent to England to become acquainted with the first Tavistock Institute rock group to hit the shores of the United States. Sullivan then returned to the U.S. to draft a strategy for the electronic media on how to package and sell the group. Without the full cooperation of the electronic media and Ed Sullivan in particular, the Beatles and their music would have died on the vine. Instead, our national life and character of the United States has been forever changed. The Beatles' ascension to the top rung of the rock and roll pantheon displaced Elvis Presley and American rock legends who had a lock on the reins of rock and roll, was rigged and engineered into place by the British Crown and the British military intelligence. The prime function of the Beatles was to be discovered by teenagers who were then subjected to a non-stop barrage of Beatles music until they became convinced that they liked the sound and adopted it along with all that accompanied it. The Liverpool group performed up to expectations with a little help from their friends, illegal substances we called drugs, and a whole new class to young Americans in precise mold ordained by the Tavistock Institute. In '63, at the first major television appearance at the London Palladium, the newspaper reported that the police had to, quote, hold back 1,000 squealing teenagers. But the story was fabricated, just like the bringing down of Hussein's statue in Iraq, all fabricated. The newspaper photo actually only tightly cropped 3 screaming teenagers and claimed it was 1,000. One reporter was there, said later there was less than 8 girls present. Similar Beatlemania hysteria was manufactured at JFK Airport in 1964 when the Beatles arrived in the USA to perform the Ed Sullivan Show. Busloads of girls from the Bronx were paid by the Beatles promoters to scream hysterically when the Beatles got off the plane and went into the terminal. It was a manufactured publicity stunt, but it was paid off by priming the pump for the Ed Sullivan Show appearances, which created a frenzied attitude among the American teenagers and set the stage for a looser rein on moral boundaries and opened the door for kids from the decent middle classes to start using drugs, which is precisely what the British intelligence, Tavistock, and CIA had in mind all along. George Martin, the fifth Beatle, did all the orchestral arrangements with Adorno on later Beatles and British bands they were assigned to. All right, and taking a quick sidebar from the Stones and the Beatles, Ziggy Stardust, David Bowie. Again, the programming, the brainwashed do not know they are being brainwashed. Here's Bowie giving the Baphomet Devil sign at Berkeley. The final albums and music of Bowie evoked a dark and deathly satanic vision of life during the first decade of the 21st century. And some of you are going to quote in the comments, he's still alive. He's a tranny. He sprang from the twisted, fevered minds of social psychologists at Tavistock Institute. Bowie was an agent of the New World Order, forcing acceptance of gender identity, politics, transvestites, transgender, gays, not to mention the furtherance of E.T. Alien, a lion meme that the New World Order sought to advance. So and then you see the follow-up on that with the world's fittest man, Bruce Jenner, decathlon champion, turning to a female. And you see all the cross-dressing that all these guys have to get into, as David Chappelle chronicled. They all have to cross-dress and whore themselves to the power to keep their power. That's the way it works. We recall the British invasion worded suitably enough, the satanic musicians turning their children into hard drugs. After a rebel Rolling Stones, the Beatles introduced LSD. They're followed by nauseating Black Sabbath, a spaced-out Deep Purple, a demonized Led Zeppelin, a lunatic Pink Floyd, a queer Queen, a tasted David Bowie, a freaky Kiss, until much of the youth were made to mindlessly rebel against everything, not just their parents, and turn to non-biblical lifestyles disguised in love and peace. Following the Tavistock Institute's study of war psychosis and its breakdown of individual personality, brainwashing how the British used the media for mass psychological warfare was written. From their work as an evil thesis emerged, through the use of terror, man can be reduced to a childlike and submissive state in which his powers of reason are clouded, in which his emotional response to various situations and stimuli can be predictable. By controlling the levels of anxiety, it is possible to induce a similar state in a large group of people. There you have the alienated teenager who never grows up, stuck in his own petty little world, as a plastic manufactured outcast who never grows up in a non-stop Peter Pan syndrome arrested development. That is the occult principle of ECI, erotic crystallization inertial meaning. Inertia is the resistance of any physical object to change in its state of motion or rest, or the tendency of an object to resist any change of its motion. So the non-stop barrage of programming on people after World War II, with the radio, then TV, plus movies and music, through the technology, was assault on the people, unaware that they were being programmed and cloned off, even rebels who were feeling alienated from society and their parents and old ideas. Alienation is a part of divide and conquer. wake up. And look where we are today with all the kids on their smartphones, tapping away, heads down, and lost in the electronic world that is owned by the same people controlling our children. All right, that's all I got for today, folks. It's a lot to be learning. You've been mind controlled your whole life, and I'm sure a lot of you are feeling the same way, but I'll put these links in the show notes. You can read for yourself. Plain Truth out. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you in the next one. Peace and love one another.